One. Hey, good morning. It's 10:01. Let's rock and roll. Welcome to the Hammerdown Podcast. My name is Jay Mervis, Senior Director of Healthcare here at Fortinet. Welcome to the podcast today. I've got my guest today is Chad Holmes, Product Evangelist at Cynerio. Good morning, Chad. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Chad, why don't you give us a little bit about your background and what you do over at Cynerio?
Yeah, so I'll try to give you the medium version. Everyone likes to talk about themselves. I started as a software developer, so hands on the keyboard, writing code for government systems. Very quickly started finding vulnerabilities in government systems, and that got me into security. And over the last 15 years or so, I've been working first on application security, so breaking systems and teaching people how to secure them, and then jumped into the wonderful world of network security 3 or 4 years ago, and absolutely loved it. At Cynerio, what we do, and what I do is I work with a bunch of really, really smart people, our team, our partners like Fortinet, to help educate people on the issues we're seeing in the healthcare space around cybersecurity, and more importantly, how we can start to protect against ransomware attacks, data breaches, et cetera. So we're very much focused on IoT, IoMT devices, making sure those are secure and making sure that hospital environments are there when we need them the most.
Yeah, and so one of the things we talked about, Chad, was this is a huge problem in healthcare right now. We think about the math on this with 15 devices per bed, 5.7 per nurse. Some of this stuff is getting better. Newer technologies coming out. There's a whole certification project, process with the FDA, other regulatory bodies to get stuff into the hospital. But what's crazy is, and when you and I were talking about your background, I remember doing some pen tests 6, 7, 8 years ago. There's Windows 95, Windows 98 machines on networks. I'd love to hear your perspective on what you see as the biggest challenge with this in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's a education challenge, if nothing else. Things are are really, really bad, and it's easy to say that in security, right? Everyone uses FUD in security because it exists, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. In healthcare, we have a really unique challenge, a couple of really unique challenges. One, because no one hears about the attacks that happen elsewhere, right? In healthcare, you care about your local hospital. For me, I live in northern New Hampshire, so I care about going down to Boston if I really need some care. But if you're not in touch with what's happening kind of across the nation or across the globe, you don't realize how bad these are. So there's a bunch of really good studies that paint a very clear picture. A lot of them are done by a group called the Ponemon Institute, who we've worked with a bunch of others. Ponemon, Larry, and team are outstanding. So some of my favorites, and I try to update these on a daily basis. First of all, 89% of hospitals got hit by a cyber attack last year. Jay, do you know what the common trend amongst the other 11% are?
Defense in depth.
No, they got hit and just didn't realize it. Sorry,
Oh,
trick
okay.
question there, right? But so effectively, hospitals are a prime target just because every dollar we want to spend on patient care, and it can be really really hard to say, hey, we need more NACs, we need more IoT security. How does that directly relate to patient care? So first, we're seeing a lot of attacks on healthcare because they're incredibly vulnerable, flat environments. Next, we're starting to see that attackers are getting very smart in how they draw revenue. Because we have to remember that attackers don't really care about killing people. They don't want to kill people. They just want to have that fear for a motive. So what they're doing is they're going after finances. And so when we see ransomware attacks, we see about a quarter of the ransomware attacks in the US are focused on healthcare because they're easy environments that pay the ransom half the time. So they become very, very nice targets for someone that doesn't mind if there's deferred care or higher mortality rates or something like that. And those payments vary from 250 grand to tens of millions of dollars. For the people that don't pay, though, this is where it gets really scary because I know, everyone that's ever watched a movie knows the FBI always says, do not pay the ransom because it encourages more attacks, right? But if you can pay a million or 2 million bucks and probably be back online this afternoon, that is a tempting offer, particularly when recovery costs are somewhere between $11 million on average and kind of 150 million or more in the worst case scenarios. So now we have a lot of attacks on vulnerable environments where there is profit to be made. And that's scary enough, but we also have to realize we're really not focused on protecting the right things. When digital records started coming about, the whole thought was the worst thing that could ever happen in healthcare from a cybersecurity attack is that your records, my records, they get exposed, right? That's embarrassing, could be a real big issue. No one ever thought, hey, an entire hospital or an entire hospital system could be taken down. And that's what we're starting to see is not only will 1 in 4 Americans have their data exposed this year, which is a terrifying number. That's grown over 1,300% in the last 5 years. But we're starting to see that 25% of the time that there's a cyber attack, we're actually going to see higher mortality rates. To put that more bluntly, 1 in 4 times there's a cyber attack, someone dies that shouldn't, or more than one person dies that shouldn't. We're seeing complications in procedures, we're seeing diversions, we're seeing cancellations. And so at the end of the day, the cyber physical threats that we're seeing in healthcare are very real. Taking off some IoT devices, taking off laptops, taking off CT scanners, and doing that in mass is leading to actual impact on patients and their treatment. And that's where it starts to get really scary. And so those are just some of the basic stats. Anyone that's seen me present before knows I have a long list of others. Jay, what are your customers scared about? What are they seeing? What stats hit them the hardest?
Yeah, the one thing that we focused on, Chad, is the operational downtime. Some of what you're talking about is pharmacy, retail pharmacy getting backed up. In the disaster recovery planning, pads of paper is a big problem. So if we don't have enough pads of paper, we can't handwrite scripts that nobody can read. The digitization of medical records, nobody wants to have to go through and worry about if their identity has been compromised. So some of what we're seeing is how does that data flow? How do we have that 5 nines uptime? And nobody foresaw this, right? I can go back to when we had record rooms. I always joke with people, hey, we're young enough to remember when there was record rooms and somebody go fetch your record. You had a big file folder or a small file folder, but now everything's digitized on the web. So and when that's in the hospital, you're right. When they go and say we're going to go compromise, we've got 100,000 records, and we see a lot of this in the rural space. There's that's the most attacked sector right now because they have the least amount of resources versus a major provider in a major metro market. They just have less people, less money, less talent to draw from, so they're immediately attacked. The one in Central Illinois that was shut down this year, that was a big one, but that's what we're seeing. And let's take this into I think we're already in the trend, but let's talk about segmentation and microsegmentation. There's been a big uptick in this. We talk, some of what we're alluding to is the flat network and identifying the connected medical devices that are modalities and older devices. I remember having to find a laptop for a glue commander that had a serial port 15 years ago. So some of that stuff's still out there because doctors want to test off the same baseline. So, what are you seeing from this as an initiative, and how does it help practically, Chad?
Yeah, so first we did a study again with Ponymon Institute last year. Lots of really good data in there. We got a ton of coverage on it, so I was right in my heyday. Absolutely loved it. But one of the things we found was that 90% of issues within healthcare, the criticality can be reduced or completely eliminated if you microsegment. Effectively, if you stop communication where it shouldn't be happening, you can stop the spread of attacks. And I'm going to dive a little deeper with you on this. When attacks happen, it only takes one entryway. Very often it's phishing, right? Phishing is
Still
going to
number
be around
one.
forever. Still number one, it will be.
Don't click. Don't click.
And you know what the problem is? We're humans. We make mistakes. And so people
Sure.
are always going to make mistakes. There's always going to be that entryway. Lots of great products out there, but we have to accept that phishing is and will always be around. So as we start to really look at things, not academically, but realistically, we have to look at how attacks are happening and what we can do to stop them. And the most effective thing we can do is stop the spread of attacks once they're in a hospital. And I'll give you a great example. We had a stress test treadmill in one of our customers that was just pinging the entire network, right? One of those things you get on, you take your shirt off, you put the stress test on, right? You're walking. That thing was just lighting up the network because it had been infected by an outside source. No stress test treadmill should ever be communicating with everything. And so what we want to be able to do is identify that within a matter of minutes, which our team was able to do, but then get even more advanced about it and take it offline, reset it as quickly as possible, and put it back into service that afternoon. And that's where microsegmentation comes into play, because with that treadmill segmented, communicating only to the 1 or 2 devices it had access to, we were able to really focus on that treadmill, take it offline, and make sure that the attack didn't spread. Because most of the time, these attacks spread over 2, 3, 4 months. They don't spread overnight and execute overnight. They take forever. And so what we're trying to do is minimize the spread address the root of the issue, and then get it offline, get it reset, and get it back in service as soon as possible. And that's exactly what microsegmentation allows us to do.
Yeah, and so when we talk microsegmentation from a trend level, it's what is the physical domain? Is it the lab? It's the clinics, it's the pharmacies, and getting those physical domains segmented off. And then we talk about the functional domains, something like a billing or radiology, so that the system, if anything gets compromised, and you're right, all the major compromises happened, and it was not they got in that morning and then shut down the hospital or shut down the entity that afternoon. It's 3, 4, 6 months. It's insane that the threat actor will sit in the network and wait until they go and find exactly what they want to go and extract. Talking about that treadmill, somebody trying to exfiltrate a database through a treadmill, probably something we need to stop as partners in this engagement.
Yeah, and I'll give you another example. We've seen lab equipment that doesn't even have a user interface, right? It's just sitting there communicating with Cynerio. Probably not a good thing that we want to be happening. And it was just trying to send data out. So to get back to microsegmentation though, what we're also able to do is there's this huge advantage we have with all these devices that have been online. So think of IoT devices and IoT devices, IV pumps, CT machines, all these glucometers, like you mentioned, they're every place. But also start thinking of the broader scope. We find Teslas on every network. We find Amazon Alexas on every network. So suddenly, if Elon and team have a vulnerability in their software, it becomes a hospital's vulnerability to deal with. That's
Right.
terrifying. But because these devices are so verbose, they're so chatty, they're just sending packets left and right. We can use that to our advantage and protection. And what it allows us to do is, one, create a really, really highly accurate inventory of these devices. What they are, where they are, data points, all the information is just sitting there in bits and bytes. And 90 some odd % of the data in hospital is unencrypted. I found that out, I was terrified. But data is just flowing back and forth, unencrypted, really easy to analyze. And so what that allows us to do is build this inventory. But it allows us to do even further analysis, which is where you started to come in, is we start to see communication patterns. And because hospital networks are so flat, and because they're so similar to each other, even though they're unique in their own little way, they're all trying to do the same things. Provide patient information to a nursing station so they can get better care, for example. We can start to see the common patterns of where communication should exist and where it should be blocked. So what that allows us to do is not only build out this full inventory, but start building out network policies and testing those network policies in a virtual environment. So now we've gone, often within 30 days, from nothing to this on-site analysis with all these devices, with all these rules. And that's where we hand it off to our good friends at Fortinet to go and say, hey, we have these policies. They've been tested. You like that plug, right? They've been tested. Now we just need to make sure they get deployed correctly. So I'm going to throw it back over to you. Can you talk a little bit about what happens when you get all those policies and how you roll them out?
Yeah, so I want to before we go and transition out of the tech side, Chad, I want to talk about something. Inventory is one of the top 5 CIS controls that was neglected during the pandemic. So it used to be where physician practice, the practice manager would get slew of gear to go and function, PCs, just basic stuff, and then higher end stuff with whatever the services were at that clinic. And none of that stuff got inventoried in the pandemic. As one of the things that we talk about is clinician satisfaction, patient satisfaction. What are we in business for, right? You're in the business of visibility. We're in the business of security and networking, and they're in the business of providing patient care, and that's what stems these problems. But one of the things that I think is a huge advantage with our partnership is we're transitioning to tech is if you could do that detailed inventory, that takes one of the top 20, probably top 5 issues that customers have to where they haven't managed or maintained a CMDB and ServiceNow and done any of those one-on-one level things. If you don't know what you own, you can't protect it. And going back to your question, though, you guys do a great job of indexing. We do a great job of enforcing policy. That's what Fortinet does. We're market leader in next-gen firewall. We have 51% of the global market. When we partner with a visibility firm like Cynerio, we go and give that customer that defense in depth, rich protection that they're looking for on all the stuff that maybe they don't have responsibility to update and patch. That's a huge problem within the tech space too, because somebody goes and gets FDA approval. That's a 3-year run, right? We're working with many medical device manufacturers, and so people are like, well, why did this show up with Windows 9? Well, because they started that process when Windows 9 was there, and nobody wants to change a variable because that's best practice, and then the FDA certifies it. So now I think there's some shared responsibility that's coming out. I'm sure you guys have been following the Patch Act and some of that legislation that's out there. So, for from the scenario perspective, Chad, how do you and the firm go and make the security play better for customers?
Yeah, we have a couple things. So first, inventory is an absolutely necessary first step, but it is not sufficient in any means, right? So the first generation of products we saw come out probably 5 or 6 years ago did a decent job of starting to find devices, but really had a tough time scaling to actually implementing security practices. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, not only do we discover those devices, but we see the communication and then hand off those network policies to Fortinet to enforce. We also have this really cool innovation called attack detection and response. Because
Mm,
we're seeing all the traffic going back and forth, um, one of the reasons that healthcare attacks are happening is because the traditional IT systems that are in place are not built for modern attacks, right? If they were, we wouldn't see all these ransomware attacks, data
right.
breaches, et cetera. So when we see that lab equipment I mentioned earlier, talking to Syria, when we see a treadmill trying to expand the attack surface, not only do we see that and say, hey, there's something wrong, but we have a research team called Cynerio Live that's actually going through this and validating an attack and more importantly, eliminating the false positives. So it's not like, hey, here's 10,000 alerts today, we'll have 10,000 tomorrow, good luck. It is every week or so, hey, here's an issue we need to work on together. And quite often those issues are taken care of in an hour or two because we do have a team dedicated to that. Really exciting though, we've also jumped on the generative AI bandwagon. What we
Mm,
found is our research team, that Scenario Live team, had methodologies that were repeatable. And you always are going to need humans to do some research. But using generative AI, we were able to repeat some of the analysis that's being done there, some of the rules in generation, and some of the false positive reduction. So now not only do we have a team that's working hard with that noise we see to filter out the noise, but we have Gen AI backing them to speed up that process. So it's a really cool, fun team in the back end over in Israel that's actually going through all this data with cutting edge technology plus some really, really smart researchers.
So, and that's awesome that the investment in the AI as well as the people, if you follow my show, I talk a lot about the fabric. So that's why we're connected is we've got over 500 ecosystem partners and we've got flexibility with Scenario with our FortiGate to match up and enforce policy and or FortiNAC. But with what we have from a visibility perspective is we have the opportunity to use our FortiManager and FortiAnalyzer with the gates, with Scenario, or with the NAC and Scenario because network access control is a big problem in hospitals. Big problem in hospitals. And there's many of our competitors that they only do A and B. You can only deploy wired and wireless, but we have a strong enough product, either the gate or the Fortinet, to do the segmentation, the micro segmentation, and have a partner like Scenario go and get visibility into all those devices. I was talking about, some of the stuff was with automating, right? Artificial intelligence, machine learning. If Scenario finds a vulnerability in a robot in a pharmacy that's at scale across the country, and we alert people, instead of the CISA or the FBI sending a bulletin saying, hey, you have blah, blah, blah manufacturers pumps. By the way, this rev, this rev, this rev. We're not handing a post-it note to an analyst that might be responsible for 22 hospitals and 500 clinics in a metro area and say, go find these 3 pumps. So that's what I think
Yeah,
is cool. Is we have all this rich visibility, defensive depth, the Fortinet, better together story with Scenario. That's awesome. Any other comments from you on how this solves this complex, crazy problem, Chad?
yeah, you referenced a robot, so I got to tell Jekylbot 5 story real quick. We actually did find robots that could go rogue within hospitals. They were deployed wrong. They were exposed to the outside world. We could take a fleet of 40 robots, kind of the size of dorm room refrigerators, 500 pounds or so, and we could charge them into the emergency room if we wanted to. And because we were able to find that and work with partners like you guys to make sure they were secured and identified, there were no attacks from those. But we have a wealth of information there. So plenty that I could talk about there, but I'll save that for another webinar.
Hey, but you know what, Chad? I did my homework. That's why I knew you guys solved the robot
I
problem.
love it. Yeah, I love it. Yeah,
So let's transition over to tunes. You maybe do some more homework, Chad.
I did.
Since you're the guest, I said the guest could pick, and you maybe go through some research. But it's like corporate Christmas for me. You said you want to talk about AJR Orchestra is one of their albums. Why don't you tell us about AJR, why you like them, and why you chose them to tie this all back into the connected medical world segmentation and our partnership?
Absolutely. So Jay, I put you through your paces intentionally. I love the albums you've had. I love that you talked about AC/DC. I love that you talked about Jimmy Buffett. Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young came up in that. But it's very rare that as you get older, you get set in your ways, and it's very rare that you hear new music that you actually
Sure.
like and kind of right. We're all comfortable with what we heard when we were 17. Um, I like quirky lyrics, kind of interesting sounds. I usually like more of a level of rawness. And I'm a huge fan of Ben Folds. And he had a new album came out. I downloaded it, and I got a recommendation of this band called AJR. They're three brothers. They were street performers growing up in New York City. I had heard them on the Dan Patrick Show, the sports talk show,
Mm.
as a bumper, right? But didn't realize it was them. Just they'd always kind of existed as I listened to podcasts for a couple years. So I download this album based on a recommendation, and the first thing I hear is just this wall of music coming at me in the first track. The track is an overture. So effectively, what they do on this album and their previous one is they've gone and said, "Hey, we have all these songs, and we're just going to do a super smash cut of all of them to lead off the album. We're going to tell you everything you're about to hear." And so the album opens up with just all these melodies. There's bass drums. There's a keytar in there, I think, at one point. There's just this wall of sound. And I'm not a huge fan of overproduction, but for some reason in this case, it works. It's produced really well. And as I look more and more into the band, they actually share a lot of their production online. They go through and they show how they've done this. I worked for Red Hat for a while, so I could go down a whole open source route here. I'm not going to because, again, we don't have that much time. But the fact that they blended all these songs together up front is like, all right, here's what you're going to hear. Get ready for it. It was great. And so I think, tie this back to microsegmentation and security, which is when you have all these components, when you have all this great stuff, you have to be able to blend them together correctly, right? Just having a firewall, just having a NAC, just having an inventory system, having a CMMS, which a lot of HTM teams use to track data by hand, it's not enough. You have to blend all the tools together, all the expertise together. You have to have funding. And sometimes that funding isn't necessarily new funding. I'm sure you see this a lot. It's taking a look at your traditional vendors and saying, oh, there's newer products that can do a lot more, often for less. Let's bring those in instead. So it's a matter of tying all those components together. And so having an overture to lead off the whole album and just tee up what you're about to hear with all these interesting components, I thought was a really, really good way to start this discussion.
Yeah, I agree, Chad. They've 4 studio albums. I took a cursory listen to a lot of it. They're growing in their fan base. I've seen it, every time they've had an album out. But I'm going to take a song and to tie into what you just said. But this is the trick of staying in front of the trick is one of the songs that I had on there. What do you have as off their roster of songs?
So the next one I have is Joe. And I love that Joe starts with a chaotic piano intro. So again, I mentioned Ben Folds, I love Regina Spektor, Elton John, and having this chaotic piano intro is really, really fun. Then it leads to this kind of change in tempo and buildups throughout the whole song. The whole point of the song is this person they grew up with that they claim to never think of, but he's always in the back of their mind, right? They have this great set of lyrics which start with "I don't ever think of you," and then immediately goes, "Do you think I'm cool?" And I thought that was so good for where we are in cybersecurity because in healthcare in particular, healthcare doesn't want to think of cyber attackers. They want to think about saving lives, giving people better, all that stuff. But in the back of the mind, the attacks are always there, and we have to start to really acknowledge that the attacks are there, and then almost kind of go to cybersecurity therapy and figure out how to address them so they're not always lingering in the back of our mind.
No, that's a good one. I'm going to take one, Chad. 100 Bad Days. If we don't continually evolve and the products, the people, product, and technology, people, process, technology, that's 100 Bad Days is what you're going to have. So
I'm gonna play off that a little bit too. I'm a big hiker in up in the Northeast. It's been raining like every day. It's a really unusual summer for us, and I'm still hiking through it. And every face I've seen on the trail looks either really, really happy or really miserable. So the miserable ones, particularly little kids, I steal from that song and I say, "A bad day makes a good story." Right? In the song, it's 100 bad days make 100 good stories. Same idea. You gotta take those bad days, make them into good stories. In cybersecurity, make it into presentations to train other people on how to protect against the attacks you saw.
yeah, and there's such a skills shortage. So it's like, who else can we educate? How do we get more people that maybe they got an accounting background, maybe they got an operations background, maybe they see what we're seeing and they're going to be aggressive in supporting this. So I mean, we're always training. I think we just broke 1 million people here at Fortinet. Our FortiGuard Labs team, they're always adding people on. So, I mean, it's the investment in the industry to get people trained up and, just more aware, right? So it's all about talent development. So, you got one last song to close us out, Chad.
I got one more, and it actually plays into what you're saying. It's World's Smallest Violin. This is just an earworm of a song, right? The tempo is all over the place. It builds up. It is a fun journey. By the way, they have music videos for all these that have kind of a raw homemade feel, but still somewhat polished. Music videos, I love them. They're making a comeback. It's great. But within the World's Smallest Violin, the whole point is you don't have to have it the worst at everyone. There's a great line in there. It says, I kind of feel like two things can be sad. It's not a competition, you got hacked worse than I did. The reality is when we go back to training, we go back to conferences, you have to learn from the experts. And the other side of that is you have to share your stories. If you look at University of Vermont, they got hit by a major cyber attack 2 years ago, and their leadership has said, we're not going to hide behind the curtains. We're going to tell everyone exactly what happened. So what healthcare needs to know is that the experts and the experienced folks are out there. They're willing to share their stories. Heck, Jay, you will talk to anyone all day. I will as well, and I'll point them in the right direction for here's what you need to do. You should talk to this person and this person. So at the end of the day, you have to take advantage of the expertise that's out there because it's going to really lead you in the right direction.
No, that's awesome. But by the way, talking about videos, this is the last random thought I'm going to have today. We're filming on August 1st. Today was when MTV was launched in 1983. So music videos are coming back. A lot of nostalgia there. We're young enough to remember when MTV played music videos and not reality TV. So, Chad, I'm going to put your contact info in the when I post this thing out. But call to action: anybody that's evaluating visibility, you want a better together story. Chad on the Cynerio side, they've got sales teams and engineers, leadership. Me, my team. You want to talk to Troy? You want to talk to Nate? You want to talk to Tom, Eric, anybody else on the roster? But Chad, thanks for being a guest on. Listen, put the hammer down, put the pedal to the metal. Trends, tech, and tunes. Tell your mom, tell your friends, share it, like it. Thanks for being on, Chad.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. Really appreciate it.